10 Democratic presidential candidates presented their vision for combating climate change at a marathon of town halls in New York last night. The candidates took questions from voters, activists, and CNN moderators. They wasted no time going after President Trump and the Republican Party, accusing them of not taking the issue seriously.
You could argue that of all the horrible things that this president has done, the one that will most be remembered 50 or 100 years from now will have to do with the failure to act on climate. At least that's what it'll be like if this goes down in history as the time that we failed to get something done.
He's dead wrong across the board on basically everything. You know, no, I mean, I'm not being facetious. Look, you know, we got to start choosing science over fantasy here. The fact of the matter is that what he did by removing the United States as the leader of the Paris Climate Accord, he in fact dissipated the enthusiasm across the board.
Donald Trump thinks that climate change is a hoax. I think that Donald Trump is dangerously wrong. I may be old-fashioned, but I believe in science.
I strongly believe this is a fight against powerful interests, and leaders need to lead. So lead, follow, or get out the way, and get out the way starting with Donald Trump.
Mandy Gunasekara is the founder of Energy 45. She is also a former senior official for the Environmental Protection Agency under President Trump and an environmental lawyer. Mandy, thanks so much for being with us. Before we turn to your organization, I want to just, first of all, get some foundational kind of basis here for our conversation. What is your position on climate change? Does it exist? How much does human activity actually play a role?
Yeah, I think that's a good start to the conversation. Yes, the climate is changing. It's always been changing. Humans have a role. The degree of that role is still the subject of a very rich debate among the scientific community, and not just the degree of human activity, but also how sensitive is our climate? What is the role of water vapor and clouds? So there's a much more complex discussion going on that is typically brought up in the context of the discussions the likes of which we saw yesterday.
So I know there is a debate that is still going on, but in 2017, under the Trump administration, the government released the National Climate Assessment, which concludes in part, quote, "It is extremely likely that human activities, especially emissions of greenhouse gases, are the dominant cause of the observed warming." So are those scientists who studied this issue wrong?
No, and that's the perspective of some of the scientists, and a lot of that is reflective of the fact that that report was largely done in the previous administration. Not to say those scientists who believe that don't still have a role in this administration. They do, and I used to be a part of comprehensive meetings where we had our engineers, scientists from all different walks coming into the room and helping inform this administration as we made the best decision, whether we were talking about greenhouse gases, clean air, or clean water.
So you don't agree with that assessment necessarily, it sounds like.
I think that that's one piece of one approach of an assessment that's actually much more diverse than that singular quote would represent.
Do you believe climate change is a crisis?
I don't think it's a crisis. I do think it's an important issue, and it's an issue this administration has taken very seriously. What a lot of people don't necessarily give the administration credit for is the fact that President Trump has put in place the first ever greenhouse gas standards for existing coal-fired power plants. It's called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, and it actually was a replacement to the Clean Power Plan, President Obama's proposal, that was stopped in its tracks by the Supreme Court before President Trump was even elected because it ignored the law. So what Trump has actually done is put in place the first ever legally viable greenhouse gas standards that are premised on allowing coal plants to update and innovate into the future instead of putting them out of business, which is more consistent with the role of balanced regulations at EPA.
Well, we mentioned the Democrats held that climate change forum. What is your response to their criticisms?
I think they're unfounded, and I wish that they would spend more time engaging with this administration in a pragmatic and constructive way instead of engaging in extreme rhetoric we saw yesterday. You know, in the climate scientists that I worked with at EPA and I got to know, a lot of them were concerned with extreme rhetoric that's often used by political proponents because they believe it does a disservice to an issue that they think is very important.
What were the specific things that you found sort of most egregious in your view about what you heard on that stage?
One of the most problematic proposals is this push to zero emissions by either 2030 or 2050. That is premised mostly on wind and solar. Now, excluding Andrew Yang, who talked about the role of nuclear, the majority of the other candidates up there do not see nuclear power as a big part of a zero emissions future. And that's extremely problematic because that is the only source of zero emissions electricity that could provide baseload technology, which is most important for providing affordable and reliable energy. And when you do away with affordable, reliable energy, what you end up doing is harming our fixed income and low income communities the most, because when they can't afford energy, they forego things like food, medicine, visiting the doctor, and keeping their house, the temperature in their house at a safe level.
I want to ask very quickly in our final minutes left here about some of your time in the Trump administration. You were part of the team advising the president to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. Why did you advise that?
Well, there are a number of reasons. One of the things the president focused on a lot was how is this going to impact American workers? He did not want to do anything that sacrifice economic growth and undercut American jobs in the way that he saw, number one. And number two, the other big flaw of it was that it gave countries like China and India, that are the real problem in terms of greenhouse gas pollution and air pollution, it did nothing to mitigate the fact that that's where the future growth is going to come from.
Why did you want to form Energy 45? Do you think this is a messaging problem for Republicans in the Trump administration, or is it that there is disagreement about the science?
It's a long-term messaging problem in the Republican Party in general. I've worked on these issues for about 8 years now in the U.S. House of Representatives, in the Senate, and in the administration. And I think the opportunity is to engage as a Republican and educate the public about what this administration is doing and how you can take a pragmatic approach to addressing environmental issues.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time. Mandy Gunasekara, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
And Amy Harder covers energy and climate for Axios. She joins me now from Arlington, Virginia. Amy, thanks for being with us. First of all, I just want to get your take on what we just heard from the former Trump EPA official who said that she believes the Democrats' attacks on President Trump over the climate are unfounded. Remind us about the policies that his administration has implemented since he took office.
Yeah, President Trump has been incredibly aggressive in rolling back almost everything that President Obama did on climate change, and even more than that. In fact, just this week, he took steps to roll back light bulb efficiency standards that were issued by bipartisan Congress under Republican President George Bush. So the Trump administration has been very aggressive in rolling back these regulations. And not only that, the rhetoric coming from the very top, coming from President Trump, has been very dismissive of climate change. The president regularly tweets about how climate change is not a real problem. And so that's why there is a lot of distrust and skepticism among most people when it comes to the Trump administration's position on climate change.
Well, I also want to get your reaction, Amy, to the 7 hours of town halls yesterday. What was your big takeaway from what you heard from Democrats, and how different was it from campaigns in recent years?
Yeah, well, it's been markedly different this year compared to any other campaign in recent memory. Climate change is finally a top issue, to the degree that there's this call from environmental activists and others to hold special climate change forums. Now, listening to Mandy really highlighted how much of a division there is on this issue between Republicans and Democrats. While scientists do say that she's wrong when it comes to the science, there is some legitimate comments she's made about the extreme positions of a lot of these proposals that these Democrats are pushing. And so most of these calls to get off fossil fuels in 11 or 20 to 30 years, it's going to be very, very impossible from a political and technical perspective. So that's one thing that I think we'll see get a lot more scrutiny as the months go on in this campaign. And then when the general election comes, whether or not a Democrat will try to shift a little bit more to the middle when he or she goes up against President Trump.
Right, and just to clarify, so Amy, you're talking about the fact that economically as well, getting off of fossil fuels, our economy is just so intertwined with the use of fossil fuels.
Right. The global energy consumption has been 81% taken up by fossil fuels. And that number, that percentage, 81%, has not changed in 30 years. So while wind and solar have grown incredibly in the last decade, and in some states like Iowa, for example, wind power is now 30% of the electricity mix. Overall, from a global perspective, it's still a very difficult challenge. And you saw some of this sort of realism, I guess you could call it, from Joe Biden, but he faced criticism for that. And you're seeing a lot of these candidates sort of responding to some of the more aggressive rhetoric in the left part of the Democratic Party. I'm going to be watching to see whether or not these activists are really the people who come out to vote in the election. I think the people who are voting in these battleground states are not as progressive as the people who are pushing the policies today.
Why hasn't that number you mentioned, 81%, moved at all?
Well, I should say that it can almost be considered a success that it didn't go up over these last 30 years, because over these last 30 years, we've increased the global energy consumption significantly. So the fact it didn't rise is actually a positive thing. But it's because the global energy demand keeps going up, and the developing world has found that fossil fuels are cheap and effective. And this is partly not just because of the chemical makeup of oil, natural gas, and coal, but also because of the billions and billions in subsidies that fossil fuel companies get around the world. That's one of the big reasons why they've maintained their power. It's because they get subsidies to be cheaper. And renewables also have subsidies, but not as much as fossil fuels over the course of their life. So I'm going to be looking to see if that number goes down at all, as this rhetoric in the Democratic primary heats up.
So after Washington Governor Jay Inslee dropped out of the race, it was suggested that he could not break through because there wasn't a lot of daylight between the candidates on this issue of climate change. So after yesterday's town halls, what key differences did we see?
Yeah, we did see a lot of differences, but I would caution that the differences are a little bit wonky. So the average consumer of news may not notice the difference. Nuclear power is certainly one of them. Mandy said that Andrew Yang supported nuclear power. He wasn't the only one. You saw some support for nuclear power from Cory Booker, for example. Elizabeth Warren came out staunchly against nuclear power. So that's one area of difference. How to go about reducing emissions, whether that's a carbon tax or some sort of market mechanism. But by and large, they all support very aggressive action. And even that is a marked change from just the 2016 and 2012 elections. It's really staggering to see how much the party has moved left in just the last couple of years. I tend to think that's due to several factors. The two big ones being climate change is becoming more urgent of a problem, and also President Trump is in the White House dismissing the issue altogether.
Well, Amy, there's a clip I'd like to play from Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren answering a question about whether the government should regulate the kind of light bulbs people should buy. Let's listen to that.
There are a lot of ways that we try to change our energy consumption and our pollution. And God bless all of those ways. Some of it is with light bulbs, some of it is on straws, some of it, is on cheeseburgers, right? There are a lot of different pieces to this, and I get that people are trying to find the part that they can work on and what can they do, and I'm in favor of that, and I'm going to help and I'm going to support. But understand, this is exactly what the fossil fuel industry hopes we're all talking about. That's what they want us to talk about. This is your problem. They want to be able to stir up a lot of controversy around your light bulbs, around your straws, and around your cheeseburgers. When 70% of the pollution, of the carbon that we're throwing into the air comes from 3 industries, and we can set our targets and say by 2028, 2030, and 2035, no more.
So, Amy, when you talk to scientists, where do they believe the solution lies?
Well, they attempt to be very apolitical. So their focus is just on reducing emissions in whatever way possible. Now, the comments by Elizabeth Warren really highlight something most of the candidates talk about, which is that you really need to penalize the oil and gas companies and coal companies for creating the products that we all have been using that are heating up the planet. And that's something that I think that I've been covering a lot, and I will continue to the degree to which oil companies are held legally liable for climate change. There's been lawsuits lawsuits to that effect, unsuccessful lawsuits, I would add. And I think it's a raging debate. You know, increasingly people are being scrutinized for their way of life. Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenage activist, got a lot of headlines for sailing over the Atlantic with a nearly carbon-free sailboat. However, in order to bring that sailboat back to Europe, they had to fly 4 people or so over to New York, which sort of canceled out the emissions.
Right.
So it's a really complicated topic, and I think it's not either or. I think it's going to be, you know, people should be more aware of their carbon footprint. But yes, there will also need to be societal changes, whether that's suing the oil companies or doing a carbon tax or, you know, all of the above, which is what many of these candidates are talking about.
Right. It's really interesting to hear this discussion about the role of personal responsibility versus corporate responsibility. Amy Harder. Amy, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.